Okay, so the learning strategy that I'm going to demonstrate is going to be introducing Realia into the classroom. And what introducing Realia into the classroom is basically it's taking real life objects and it's connecting them with content knowledge, and it's helping the students to build a connection between the two to relate them back to their real lives. It's an easier way for them to remember key ideas or important ideas, and it's a good way for them to just learn better and easier. If a student can relate the material that they're learning to their real life, then that is probably the best way to learn, in my opinion. And the way that I'm going to demonstrate this is by doing the lecture that I have for my lesson, and the lesson is going to be on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So before I get into the whole lesson on the Cuban Missile Crisis, I just want to touch on the major players in the crisis itself and what actually was going on, like a little bit of an overview before I get into things. So we have the United States, obviously, and here's the flag for the United States. They're going to be one of the key players in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the leader in the United States during this time is going to be President Kennedy. And then secondly, we have Russia or the Soviet Union. Here's their flag, and this is where they're located. And the leader in Russia at this time, when the crisis is going on, is going to be Khrushchev. And then lastly, we have Cuba, which is located right here, and here's the Cuban flag. And the leader in Cuba at the time of the crisis was going to be Castro. And understand that the crisis happened in October of 1962. And also, you have to understand that there was two little sub-players in the whole thing. So we have Italy right here and Turkey right here. And they're sub-players because the United States had nuclear missiles placed in Italy and placed in Turkey. So, two nukes. And they were both pointed directly at Russia and the Soviets up here. You see they're right here, pointed there. And Cuba knew that they had these missiles, and Russia knew that they had these missiles there, and they obviously had to do something about it. So eventually, they're going to create a little plan, and they're going to get a missile placed in Cuba. And it is going to be pointed right at the United States. So what was this crisis exactly? The Cuban Missile Crisis was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And it was a moment in history whenever two superpowers came the absolute closest to nuclear war ever. And why did it happen? So the Bay of Pigs invasion was one of the major points that kind of started the whole thing off. The CIA was attempting to push Castro out of power, and they talked President Kennedy into allowing a full-scale invasion into Cuba. So, troops got up and came over from America and invaded. But, like I said before, it was not successful. It made Kennedy actually look very, very bad, and he was not pleased with the outcome. So, since the U.S. attempted to invade and overthrow this new communist government in Cuba, it was very apparent that Cuba now needed protection. So the Soviets seen this go on, and they were like, okay, I think that this is a good time for us to get our foot in the door. We know that Cuba is right below the U.S., very close, within missile distance. So how about we get on their good side and see if we can't get some missiles of our own over in Cuba. So the Soviets came up with this whole big plan, and Castro and Khrushchev talked it out, and Cuba agreed that if the Soviets would provide protection, so that way they knew that they wouldn't be invaded by America or really any other countries anymore, then the Soviets would be allowed to bring in nuclear missiles and point them at the U.S. And this idea was basically, the U.S. already had two missiles pointed over at Russia, so they wanted to counterbalance it. They wanted to give the Americans something to think about, just so they couldn't really freely just launch nukes. So now they had their own nuke that's over here in Cuba, pointed right at the U.S. But there was a little flaw in the plan. A U.S. spy plane was just flying over, and they discovered what was going on in Cuba. They seen the missiles being built and so on. So what did the spy plane go and do? Went and told the president. So the president looked into it and turned out that it was an actual real plane. But the issue was that the missiles were pretty much already in place and they were basically already ready to go by the time that they went and looked at things. So with that being said, the United States decided that it was time for them to take action. So the first thing that Kennedy did was he went live on television and he told the American public that the Soviets indeed did have nuclear weapons over in Cuba and that they were facing directly towards us. And he obviously asked them if they would just remove the nukes, but they told him no, because why would they take their nukes out if the United States had nukes pointed right at them? It was for a defense mechanism, so they said. So, since they couldn't see eye to eye, President Kennedy decided to set up a blockade. And what a blockade was he called the Navy, and they brought their ships in, and they surrounded the island of Cuba. And it basically stopped any nuclear material from coming in or coming out. Well, that was the idea behind it that Kennedy had. Kennedy's idea was, if I build this blockade, then no more nuclear materials can come in or come out. So that means that the production or building of this nuclear plant had to be halted. But there were a few issues with this. Obviously, with the blockade being built, nothing could come in or out. Not only was it deterring away the nuclear parts that were coming in, but also it wasn't allowing in any food or any resources or anything that the Cubans really needed to survive. And it was also viewed as an act of war towards the Soviets. Granted, it was not an act of war. They argued the fact, but that's how it was viewed. So like I said, the problem with it was that the U.S. insisted for the Soviets to remove them, and they wouldn't. So the blockade was set up. And also, this kind of put the public on edge. As you could imagine, they were all stocking up on food and water and necessities that they felt they would need. They were making fallout shelters. They were just basically preparing for complete and utter nuclear destruction. They were waiting for the nukes to fall from the sky at any minute. And this caused complete and utter chaos. And it just wasn't good for the community or like the country as a whole. So in the days of the crisis, a U.S. spy plane again was flying over, and it was shot down. So as you could imagine, that could cause a few issues. It wasn't viewed as an act of war from America. They actually viewed it as something a little bit different. The U.S. sent a depth charge down to a Soviet submarine, and that was just signaling for it to surface. Not as an act of war or anything like that, it was just a signal for them to surface to the top. But the submarine, they believed that the charge was an act of war and that nuclear war had actually begun. So they readied their nuclear missiles. In order to shoot those nuclear missiles on that submarine, all three of the crew members on the submarine had to vote yes in order to do so. The first two voted yes, but the last person voted no. And that no vote probably saved the world as we know it. Just because the submarine didn't launch its nukes, that didn't necessarily mean that the war was over. So the U.S. actually did go into DEFCON 2, and what DEFCON 2 is it is one step away from actual nuclear war. So they readied hundreds of missiles. Hundreds of missiles ready, pointed right at Russia, ready to go, and Russia probably did the same thing. So there was one act that kind of saved the day. With all this commotion going on, all these nukes being readied, there was two people that didn't really partake in that. And those two people were Robert Kennedy and Anatoly Dobrinin. And they had a secret meeting behind the scenes, and in this meeting they came to an agreement. And this agreement was that the United States would pull their nuclear missiles out of Italy and pull their nuclear missiles out of Turkey. Also, they would never invade Cuba again, and they would just leave Cuba be. Leave them as they are. In exchange for doing this, the Russians were expected to remove their nuclear weapon out of Cuba as well, under a UN inspection. So, both parties removed their missiles, and the conflict was ended in diplomacy. And there's a few very important takeaways from this. The first and most obvious is that the nuclear threat was finally over. The public was at ease, and everyone was really at ease. The leaders all felt good about it, and it was a very big weight lifted off of the shoulders of both Russia and America, because potentially they both could have been blown up forever. This also led to the MAD theory, and what MAD theory is a theory of mutually assured destruction. And what that means is, let's say the United States shoots a nuke at Russia. Well, Russia is going to shoot a nuke right back at them, assuring destruction on both sides. That idea kind of is going to deter people away from shooting nukes, because your country knows if you're going to shoot a nuke at a country, that country is going to turn around and shoot a nuke at you. So it kind of is pointless. It makes it pointless to shoot nukes off. It also showed that two very, very powerful leaders were able to resolve a conflict peacefully, and it was kind of like a wake-up call for other countries, and it was like a role model type deal as well, because at this time, Russia and the U.S. were two of the biggest powers in the world. So to see that these two powers can come to a peaceful agreement and a massive conflict like this, that said something. Also, JFK looked like a massive hero, and he needed it because he literally got embarrassed and looked very, very dumb with the Bay of Pigs invasion. So this was his redemption for the Bay of Pigs, and it made him look good. As well as Khrushchev, he was admired for knowing when to step down, to back down from a challenge, because you have to understand this time the U.S. was probably the most powerful military. So the Russian public, everyone in Russia, they knew that if we went to war, it was not going to be pretty for them. So they admired him for knowing when to back down, and they felt that he saved them in a way. And also the relationship between Russia and the U.S. got tremendously better. For example, a hotline was actually made, and it connected from the White House to Russia. So in case any conflict like this were to happen in the future, it could be resolved just by picking up a phone. And then lastly, a nuclear test ban treaty was signed, and basically this just ensured that the stuff that was going on during the Cuban Missile Crisis just can't happen. You can't decide one day you want to put nukes in another country and aim them at you. That can't happen. So this made it so that the playing field was fair and people weren't placing nukes everywhere. And that is all.